It is now my privilege to bring to you Mr. Jack Roper and his paper, Justice, Moral, Constitutional, or Both.
The word justice comes from the Latin word justia, from iustus, meaning just, and ius, meaning right. So justice means righteousness and equity. Justice has a perfect definition, but is near impossible to apply to a fallen world. Situations that follow injustice will always have two opposing sides, both with their own ideas of justice. One side may be unsatisfied with the justice enforced, which may even lead to further unfairness and inequality. Justice is a very perfect and holy notion that is often...
He doesn't have the camera on!
Sorry, go with the mic on. Excuse me.
Justice is a very perfect and holy notion that is often tainted and destroyed when humans attempt to force it. One only needs to read Exodus and the Lord's 10 Commandments to understand that God intends for us to strive towards righteous behavior. Administering justice can easily turn to a form of judgment, and God is the one true judge. Therefore, we must use caution. In Matthew 7:3, Jesus questions, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Someone should not judge another man as they are imperfect. The 10 Commandments give Judeo-Christian religions a straightforward summation of ethical and moral guidelines in the Bible and the Torah. Different cultures and governmental bodies vary in the ways they enforce justice. The leaders of society and governments enforce laws to cause justice and enforce morality, but always seem to fall a little short. A city could split into two areas and be governed differently. Take the city of Berlin in Germany during the Cold War as an example. One city, two parts, two entirely separate governments, and two sets of laws. On the west side, the citizens could move freely throughout the city and the rest of the world. However, the unfortunates who were trapped on the east side were unable to venture beyond the perimeter. The Federalist Papers bring up the topic of justice and what the justice system in America was like at the time of its earliest days. The essays were written by a few of the founding fathers who gave their different opinions on why America's democratic republic was either an advantageous or incorrect choice. The foundation of American justice can be traced back to the Christian God and has some roots in Greek and Roman mythology and history. In Homer's Odyssey, there are many examples of unmitigated injustices forced upon people by others. Odysseus left his homeland and wife Penelope to fight in the Trojan War with his men. After the war ceased, fully 10 years passed before he returned to his wife. Most people assumed he was dead and assumed that Penelope was a widow. Many suitors tried to woo her, but she was faithful to her husband and denied ever admire her. She was morally just. During Odysseus' adventures, he found himself on the island of Aea, facing a seductress which named Circe. She seduced Odysseus' men and turned them to swine, and would only restore them to humans if Odysseus agreed to stay with her. To save his men, Odysseus betrayed his wife and his marriage vows. Later in the epic, he is trapped in the land of the Cyclops. Odysseus is caught in another moral dilemma here, where he has to either blind the Cyclops, called Polyphemus, or allow himself and his men to be eaten by the creature. Polyphemus begins to eat a few men each day, and death was imminent. Odysseus and his remaining men disguise themselves as they hide under some sheep that Polyphemus was releasing for the day to graze. Odysseus surprises Polyphemus by throwing a spear into his eye, blinding him forever. Choosing morality is not always black and white. It could be said that both characters acted immorally. Polyphemus ate multiple men and barred them from escaping, which was evil. Odysseus could also be considered unprincipled, since he pierced the single eye of the monster, leaving him blinded for life. Both sides committed injustices, but it is difficult to say who behaved worse. In In most of Greek mythology, there is no straightforward definition of morality, since the gods tend not to follow the moral laws themselves. Because the gods often choose immorality, it should not be assumed that people follow the laws either. In fact, the gods, for entertainment purposes, would occasionally trick or provide situations which provoke temptation for the mortals. One example is when Odysseus was leaving the island of Aea, and Circe warned him of the Strait of Mycena, where the sirens claimed the lives of sailors. She told him that all men that enter are seduced by the singing of the sirens and drown. He, in turn, instructed all his men to stuff their ears with beeswax and securely bind him to the mast. He issued firm orders not to untie him for any reason whatsoever. Odysseus was curious to hear the song of the siren, but understood that the temptation to swim to the sirens might be too great for him to resist. He could have plugged his ears as well, but he chose to listen to the song. If he would have given in to the temptation, he would have lost his life, leaving his wife a widow, subjecting her to harsh vulnerabilities from unscrupulous evildoers. Odysseus had a moral responsibility as a husband and a friend. He was selfish when he did not do everything he could to keep himself safe. At one point during the journey, the boat landed on Thrinacia, Helios' island. Helios was the god of the sun, and his island was covered with sacred sun cows. Odysseus told his men not to touch these cattle. However, behind his back, they killed a few of these cows and were cursed by Helios for the act against him. They were unjust towards Helios and the other gods. Their actions could be considered as being out of necessity as a source of food, but also an act of thievery against Helios. Justice was administered by the gods, but out of anger and not morals. Odysseus again acted selfishly when he landed on the island of Ogygia. He allowed himself to be seduced by Calypso for roughly 7 years, which meant a further prolonged separation from his wife. He was enchanted by Calypso's songs and refused to reject her advances for an extended period. Without that detour, his travels home would have lasted 36 months, which would not have been enough time for rumors of his death to spread. Penelope would not have experienced advances from her suitors. She would not have been vulnerable for all those years. Rather, she would have enjoyed the protection of her husband. Marriage is a commitment of spouses vowing to one another that they will care for one another and support each other. Odysseus did not abide by his commitment to his wife, and when he put his adventures and other women before her, his choices were neither moral nor just. In the Iliad, the Trojan War was started over a competition of vanities. Eris, the goddess of discord, was routinely ignored by her sister goddesses, especially Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, who were all boastfully vain. Eris visited a celebration attended by the three goddesses, and to spite them, she left behind a piece of fruit now known as the golden apple of discord. The goddess in possession of the apple would hence be known as Calliste, or the most beautiful. Immediately, the three women began to quarrel about the apple and who was its rightful owner. Each considers themselves the most beautiful. Finally, they chose a mortal boy named Paris to select the righteous owner. Each goddess began to vie for Paris's attention, making promises to him should he choose them. It was Aphrodite who dangled the largest carrot by promising the hand of the most beautiful mortal woman, even though she was already wed. Everyone understood that that woman to be Helen of Troy, married to King Menelaus. With Aphrodite's blessing, Paris kidnapped Helen and eagerly married her, thus causing Menelaus to wage war against the Greeks. Homer called this the Trojan War. Paris did not consider his act unjust because he had Aphrodite's blessing. He was reveling in having married the world's most beautiful woman and was not concerned with who paid a price for his happiness. Paris put his personal interests before others, which is destructive and selfish. His decisions affected people in Troy and Greece and caused thousands of men to lose their lives fighting war. It is unfortunate the Greeks did not know the one true God. If they had, perhaps they would have not allowed Paris to marry a married woman, and there would not have been a war, and God would have administered justice directly to the three vainglorious women. Diomedes was a Greek commander of an unjust character who was a strong force against Troy. He received his strength from the gods that were supposed to enforce justice. However, killing people dishonorably is unjust no matter who sanctions it. Two other soldiers, called Ajax and Hector, were equally immoral and made unjust decisions when commanding their forces. Their decisions were based upon sudden impulse and not careful planning, which unjustly puts the lives of many men at risk. Hordes of men were led to their death due to misguided moral purpose. Trojan military commanders sent spies to the Greek camps to kill the enemy. The spies were murdered in the process, which created more tension and injustice on both sides. Some of the gods began to take sides on the war and create more chaos and unethical standards than there would have been without any intervention. The gods of mythology are meant to represent justice. However, their self-interest and ego often clouded their goals. In Greek mythology, what was considered equitable to the gods was not just, and they broke their own rules. The three Theban plays consist of three separate stories that have been strung together and are another great example of injustice. At the time, Greek culture believed that the gods had decreed that all men must be buried. It was also considered insane to oppose the gods. One place where this is shown is in the story of Antigone. She had two brothers that fought on opposite sides of a war in her city. Her brothers killed one another in battle, so their uncle, King Creon, barred the townspeople from burying the brother who took up arms against the city. Horrified, Antigone exclaims, "It wasn't Zeus, not in the least, who made this proclamation, not to me. Nor did that justice dwelling with the gods beneath the earth ordain such laws for men." Antigone believes Zeus to be the true god and authority of all, not Creon. The deceased sibling was left to rot on the streets outside the city, and Antigone agonized. Not burying the dead broke the laws of the gods, so Antigone buried her brother. Because she had violated the king's decree, she was remanded to a prison cell. The moral standards that the gods had set in place were ignored. From Antigone's perspective, not burying the dead was immoral. However, Creon felt he needed to set an example and had little choice in the matter. From Creon's standpoint, everyone had just come out of a war and needed some directing and enforcing of justice, and he saw his decision as one of the best ways to do that. Sophocles said in Antigone that there are rules that the gods put in place when they created the earth, and there are a large series of these laws that Creon ignored when he ruled. In ancient Greek culture, morality was often measured by how members of the society or community worshipped and followed the laws of the gods. Morality is something that people must devote themselves to and not just pretend to follow. In his book, Oedipus Rex, Sophocles writes about a man whose background was riddled with immoral choices. Unbeknownst to him, he was adopted. At one point during his childhood, a priest told him that he would have great power as king and was going to kill his father and marry his mother one day. He adored his adoptive parents and feared the prophecy. Therefore, he fled his home forever to prevent it from occurring. While he was traveling, he came across a man who was blocking the roadway and killed him. And that the reader later learns that it was Oedipus's biological father, and coincidentally the king, who perished. When Oedipus reached Thebes, the news of the king's death had reached the city, and the queen was now a widow. Oedipus offered the queen his hand in marriage and wed her, not knowing she was his biological mother. He vowed to find the man who killed her husband, the king, not realizing it was he. The queen believed that it was her son who killed her late husband because of the prophecy that she heard years before. It was unjust for Oedipus to kill a man for being on the roadway in the first place. In this story, Sophocles continued to elaborate on how Oedipus had children with his mother since becoming king. The offspring were both his children and his half-siblings. He later discovered that the man he killed was his own father, then understood the queen to be his mother. There was an outrage in the town, and he was banished from the city for committing such immoral and unjust acts against his family and the citizens of the kingdom. Oedipus was unjust when he did not give the man on the road, the king, his father, the simple opportunity to walk in the street. He was also not following any morals when he married and had children with his mother. It may have been accidental, however, it was still unjust. Biblical justice is something that St. Augustine writes about in his book, Confessions, stating that every human will break the law of God at some point in their lives. He wrote about the sinful experiences he had as a child, young man, and man in the Confessions in the city of God. In the Confessions, Augustine wrote about parts of his childhood where he sinned against God and his family. He indulged in sinful delights and pleasures of life. St. Augustine explained how people are sinful by nature because of the original sin that Adam and Eve committed when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Augustine challenged, "Who can recall to me the sins I committed as a baby? For in your sight, no man is free from sin, not even a child who has lived only one day on earth." St. Augustine spends most of the book dissecting what is considered sinfulness and what makes humans sinful at birth. He was Christian, so he spoke about the Bible in a large part of his book. He recalled how Adam and Eve passed on this intrinsic sinfulness after the fall of man. The only way to experience forgiveness is to ask it from God. In the Oresteia, Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, fought in wars against other city-states for many years. While he was away, his wife, Clytemnestra, was unfaithful. She cheated on her husband with Aegisthus, the king's nephew. They plotted together to kill her husband when he returned from the war. Clytemnestra made her husband think he was being welcomed with open arms, when in reality, she planned to kill him in the bath once he returned from the battle. The story is full of betrayal and characters who constantly commit injustices against one another and the people around them. To the reader, they most often see the wife and her lover as the villains, but it is possible that, in Clytemnestra's mind, Agamemnon was unjust when he left her. Justice can be carefully administered only after a clear understanding of all sides. The Ten Commandments represent the basis of justice in a Judeo-Christian religion. Without these commandments, we would not have a basis of morality or just behavior. Morality is not inherent to people, so the Ten Commandments provide us with a foundation. The first commandment instructs people to have no gods other than our God. The second commandment tells us idols must not be created. These refer to any injustice we might commit against God by putting anything before him. The third refers to using the name of the Lord in vain, which would also be an injustice towards God. Another commandment instructs people that breaking the Sabbath is immoral. The Sabbath it's supposed to be a day without work to recognize how God did not perform any acts on the seventh day and honor his creation. He also commanded people to honor our parents, which Oedipus did not do. God declared that adultery is sin. Clearly, Odysseus and Clytemnestra were adulterers. Another commandment is not to steal, which is a great example of a moral dilemma, as it is unjust towards another person. It is taking something which belongs to someone else to have as your own, even though you're not entitled to it. The last example is of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Murder is illegal in all countries of the world. However, justice is not black and white in some of these situations. Some people may have to kill to defend themselves from an attacker. In the cases of war, casualties are an expected conclusion. Oedipus attacking the Cyclops is another example of self-defense. These are just a few examples, but they are a great display of a perfect justice that people can strive to achieve. Justice can be misinterpreted easily, and having a firm genesis to turn to under stress is the basis of a healthy society. Justice in America is based primarily on the 10 Commandments that are detailed in the Bible. The justice system is imperfect because imperfect people have created laws and are enforcing them. For example, the death penalty is a punishment that is commonly used to punish murder. The moral flaw is that there is someone imperfect giving themselves the right to punish someone else for being perfect. Also, if a murderer is punished for being murdered, there should be nothing to stop that person from being killed as well. The Federalist Papers explain how the American government works, including details about the justice system. Justice tends to be very one-sided in America. For example, murder could be considered self-defense in some situations, and therefore the person is not at fault. However, the person considered threatening might not have been threatening anyone. More recently, the general public's interpretation of the justice system has changed. It has always been the case that people were innocent until proven guilty. In the United States, it has always been the case that someone could be charged with many crimes. However, their innocence is presumed until guilt is formally determined by a jury. In society, order must be created to keep everyone safe, and justice is an ideal way to keep the order. In democracy, this justice is created by society and enforced by society. According to Robert Kennedy, the glory of justice and the majesty of law are created not just by the Constitution, nor by courts, nor by the officers of law, nor by the lawyers, but by the men and women who constitute our society, who are the protectors of the law, as they themselves are protected by the law. All humans have an inherent desire to look out for self-interest at the expense of others, even though it may be sinful. The ethics that determine what is just and unjust is based highly on what is called sin in various religions, demonstrated here in the 10 Commandments from Judeo-Christian scripture. The American justice system is based on Judeo-Christian beliefs. The Federalist Papers explain this very unique government system that we have. America is a democratic republic, which is a government that gives citizens the power to elect representatives that represent them in decisions regarding their well-being. This puts the citizens in control of who's making their decisions, but not giving the citizens direct control of the politics. American justice is based mostly on Christian morality because the founding fathers of this country were Christian. It is obvious that they used the Bible and the 10 Commandments to frame the laws of the new country. St. Augustine expands on the ideas that the 10 Commandments create in his books, the Confession and the City of God. The 10 Commandments also give a very solid definition to what is moral and right. The Iliad has a number of stories that can be used as examples of the complexities of justice. The Odyssey also includes a number of these examples of ethical quandaries. The characters are unjust in both books, just as real people often are. Justice itself has a very perfect definition, but applying it to an immoral world creates imperfection. The arguably deeply flawed Louis Farrakhan was still able to argue a truth when he said, "There really can be no peace without justice. There can be no justice without truth, and there can be no truth unless someone rises up to tell you the truth." Justice can be tainted and one-sided when applied by human beings. God is the one true judge, and his actions cannot be replicated by people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roper. Give me a moment to collect my thoughts. We'll go ahead and start some questioning. Thank you for the examples that you gave throughout your paper of justice and injustice. And you did give many examples, but it would be nice to have a little bit more concisely what your definition of justice is. What is justice?
Justice is whatever. It depends on where it's used, but in a Christian sense, I think it is what is considered moral, and I think simply put, just what is considered moral.
Okay, so what is just and what is moral are pretty much mutually exchangeable words.
In a Christian sense. In others, it might be different, but in a Christian sense, yes.
Okay, could you explain in a pagan sense how you'd answer that question?
I think in a pagan sense, that would be more kind of the flaw that I talked about in my paper, where people are trying to enforce justice on other people, but it kind of falls apart because that's having people who are themselves unjust enforcing justice on others.
Mm-hmm. All right. Can we go to the comment that you made about Oedipus? And if I might remind you, it is Oedipus, not Oedipus. Just so we get that straightened out. You said he was also not following any morals when he married and had children with his mother. It may have been accidental, however, it was still unjust. Now, when he marries his mother, is that an act of injustice or an act of misfortune?
Definitely a case of a misfortune. That's obvious, but I think it would also be a case of immorality, because it's, even though it was accidental, it was still an incest. So, yeah.
All right. And so even though it was an act that is committed without knowledge, is still unjust if, in fact, the act itself is an unjust act, even though the perpetrator is not aware of that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'd like to go back to a comment you made about Greek mythology. It said, in most of Greek mythology, there's no straightforward definition of morals, since the gods tend not to follow the laws themselves. The Greek gods themselves were oftentimes quite immoral, and yet the Greeks had an awareness of what morality was. Particularly, I always like the example in the Odyssey of Eumaeus, a fellow basically does everything right. Very, very honorable, very pious man. And in your definition, you talked of justice as being the law of God. If the Greeks didn't have gods that were just, how could they have a concept of what justice was?
I think in my paper, that's kind of my point, is that they didn't have a true definition of justice. So anytime they would have been trying to enforce it, it would have been nearly impossible.
Well, the Greeks did have codes of law. They had societies that imposed law, and much of the morality that was imposed was pretty conventional. Don't steal, don't murder, don't rape. These are things that we associate with our own code of justice and morality. And so they had a code, and yet their deities were very, as you point out, very perverted. And so, can you comment any further on how that society, without a system of deities that gave moral direction, could still, in general, have morality enforced in their society?
I they can still have morality enforced in their society, but it isn't a perfect morality. There's still going to be difficulties, and also you'll still have people who are themselves in a fallen world trying to enforce justice on others, which is flawed in itself.
All right, thank you very much. We'll take other questions. And let me just, before we do that though, let me get some of our onliners to get their video cameras on. Jack, Scarlett, Milena, Peter, Sarah, let's all get your videos on so we can see your faces as you can see ours. But with that, let's go ahead and open up to others who have questions.
I saw your hand first.
Okay, so by your example when you're talking to Strange about Oedipus, someone who does something illegal without knowing, even without knowing, is unjust, correct? That's kind of what you said.
I didn't say it was illegal, but
if they did something what that was not moral or unjust, even if they didn't necessarily know that what they were doing was immoral, they would still be unjust. Do you understand what I'm saying?
yes, yeah.
So if someone was like, by that like kind of definition, then someone who has passed illegal substances without knowing, they should be tried exactly as someone who took those substances knowingly.
Well, I don't think they really should be tried, because that kind of goes back to the issue of people who are themselves in a fallen world enforcing justice on others, which...
How is that example different than Oedipus' situation? Because at that time, culturally, since I believe he saved the town from the Sphinx, if I remember correctly, and so they made him king, which is why he married Jocasta in the first place. So culturally, what he was doing by marrying the queen was fine. So his situation, he thought his parents were somewhere else. He literally had no idea he was marrying his mother.
Mhm.
But you say that was unjust of him. So how is that situation different than someone who has passed like illegal substances?
Accidental.
They're both accidental.
Okay. Okay. I think it would still be considered unjust. Whether or not they could be tried for it, I'm not sure. If we look at it from a Christian sense, if we're following God, we would be forgiven of those injustices. So, yeah, I think that's the easiest way to answer your question. I hope I answered it.
Kind of, but I'll let other people ask.
Okay.
Well, what is the purpose of your justice if there is something that can be unjust? If you say that something unintentional can be unjust, but you aren't going to take it in, or it's not just to take it into a court of justice, but then you're saying that there's something else that is equally unjust, but you are allowed to take it into a court of justice. What do you mean by justice? I don't even understand what you're trying to say that justice is if it's something that can be seen in two different circumstances of the exact same thing, except one is right, the other is wrong, even though they're both unjust.
Could you possibly simplify your question?
Yes.
I think we'd all appreciate that.
Yes. You said that someone is unjust if they do something wrong without knowing.
Mm-hmm.
You also said that someone is unjust if they do something wrong and they know it. Additionally, you said that the person who did something wrong and they knew it could be tried for it, and then someone who did something wrong and they didn't know it couldn't be tried for it. What is the purpose of this justice if it doesn't allow for any, if someone is equally unjust both ways, then why don't you try them for it?
Okay, I see what you're saying. So, I think with this, whether or not they're being tried in the government that they are in isn't really associated with God enforcing justice upon them, or any morality, but so it's kind of hard to discuss about all the different governments and what they consider as just and not just. But in a Christian sense, I think they both committed injustice, but Yeah, I think that's again mostly how much I can answer that question.
But you said that justice is what people consider to be just. In your paper, you said that justice is whatever a government believes to be moral or believes to be just, and that there is a separate true morality from that,
Yes.
but that the government still have an equal ability and legitimacy to try someone based on what they believe to be just.
Yes, but there is still a flaw there. Because
Well, then what is the purpose of enacting justice at all if that flaw is something that makes it so that the justice is meaningless?
I'm sure I said it somewhere in this paper, I don't remember exactly where, but I said that different governments still have to have some type of justice system that they're trying to attain to keep order. It's not a moral justice, but it's still they kind of have to have something or there would be anarchy in that country. And it's kind of going
But
in a
whatever they
direction
believe
for
to
me.
be just is justice.
Yeah, yes. But it's not really the direction of my paper. That's going into all the different minutiae of different countries when what they consider just.
That's not minutia, it's just asking a question about the nature of justice and where justice is derived from. But you can move on to another question.
Thank you. Heather?
Hi, good job. I had a couple questions. The first one is, you used Penelope, Odysseus' wife, as an example of moral justice. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on how she was, how she exhibited moral justice?
Mm-hmm. So with that, I was kind of just talking about how she was staying true to her husband. She wasn't cheating on him in any way. That was kind of what I was talking about with her moral justice.
Okay, and then you also mentioned, I believe, I can't remember who, but someone committing an injustice against God. How would you say is a way that you commit injustice against God?
Breaking the Ten Commandments in some way, I think, is the most simple way of putting that.
Thank you.
Jackie, do you have a number of online questions?
Okay. Anna.
Okay, so I like your paper. I will say a few questions. Now, my question is, can we reason to some degree whether an action is moral without the Bible? Because I see that you made a lot of references to the Ten Commandments in the Bible.
Yeah.
But is it possible that we could determine the morality of an action without using it?
I think it would be difficult to identify morality using anything but the Bible. I kind of was trying to get to the point with my paper that without God, there is no true morality. People might be trying to attain it and have some idea of it, but it's not true, perfect morality. Does that answer your question?
So, for example, I'm sorry?
Does that answer your question, or?
I have a few more.
Okay.
So, for example, you stated in your paper that most governments, if not all, have legislation against murder.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a case where we are able to determine the morality of an action, right?
Yes, because that is something that is in the Ten Commandments.
But even if the country in question did not explicitly use the Ten Commandments as a resource, wouldn't they have been able to determine that for themselves, the morality of an action?
I think so. If I understand your question correctly, yes, I think so.
Okay, so this brings me to my last sort of question. So if Orestes was justified in killing Clytemnestra to avenge her murder of Agamemnon, why was Clytemnestra not justified when she killed Agamemnon for murdering their daughter Iphigenia?
That kind of goes to what I discussed in this paper when the death penalty. You're having someone killing someone else because they were a murderer. So it's kind of hard to identify where that stops. because then someone could kill Clytemnestra for killing Oedipus, and it could just keep going on. There's really no stopping point, so that's kind of the human flaw.
Then who is justified to avenge, murder, stealing? Who is justified?
I don't think they really are. I think that is God's job to identify who is forgiven for murdering someone else. I think avenging is itself just something that humans are trying to do, and it's not very, it's not perfectly just. Okay.
We still have a lot of online questions.
Yeah. Is that Liam?
Yeah.
Okay. Liam.
Hi, really good job on your paper. My question was, how can we reconcile justice and retribution while maintaining order in a society? You say in your paper, people are giving themselves the right to punish someone else in reference to capital punishment. I was just wondering, at what point does that stray into injustice? Like, when does a traffic ticket and capital punishment, where can you just draw the lines between what is an imperfect being imposing their imperfect beliefs onto someone else?
Okay, so first with the traffic ticket, that isn't in the Ten Commandments. We don't have in the Ten Commandments, you can't break any rules on the road. So I don't think that really applies that much to moral, perfect justice. In the case of the capital punishment, I think in God's eyes, that whoever is enforcing the capital punishment is being morally unjust. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand really where human authority to rule on these sort of things. So are you saying basically there should be no retribution for any sort of murder, or because let's say you put the murderer in jail, is that not also using authority to punish someone else? Is that also using the right to punish someone else?
Yes, it is. I think that kind of goes back to there needs to be order in some societies. I personally don't know where where the societies have to stop with their justice, but there needs to be some form of it, or the whole world would be killing one another. It would be like Cain and Abel. And I think it's not Ellery.
So good job on your paper, I really liked it.
Thank you.
My question is, you say killing people dishonorably is unjust no matter who sanctions it. And my question is, if someone in authority over you instructs you to commit an unjust act, like if you're in the military and your superior tells you to kill someone, and you think it's unjust, but you do it anyway, is your action actually unjust, or is the command just unjust, and you are actually behaving as law, obeying authority is the
Okay. I think you enforcing that justice is, no matter who's commanding it, is still unjust because you're following along with the order. So I think, yeah, there's another moral flaw there.
So the act is unjust. The act that's happening to the other person is unjust. But are you the one killing the person? Are you the one administering the injustice, or is it the person who commanded you to do it?
Both. Because there's someone who is deciding that the person should be killed, and also the person who is administering it because they're following the order. Okay. Mrs. Lawson.
Yes, actually, there's a couple things about your paper. I'm asking, my question will be, can you affirm what I have gleaned from your paper and maybe expand on it? There's a couple of things that I have not had come to light until your paper. So one of the things that you had mentioned was that Augustine himself had said that all men are unjust and that men are sinful because of their original parents, Adam and Eve. So they're born with a sinful nature, which makes them inherently sinful in the first place. So I can definitely see that. I'm sure you'd affirm that. The other thing that I want to grab onto there is, in the Ten Commandments, you pointed out that we're to honor the Sabbath because God rested on the seventh day. So here's what my takeaway on that was, I've never seen before, that when God rested on the seventh day, there was no sin on that day, the seventh day. So there was no sin to be committed. So we're to honor it, but because of our inherent sinful nature from Adam and Eve, even on every Sabbath, we still have a sinful nature and therefore can have a propensity to sin on that day. So I'm asking, can you affirm my perception of that? And then if we're inherently sinful, and we're to I'm holding that to also on the Sabbath, which is supposed to be a sinless day, and we're still sinful, then I'm asking you to affirm, then man has the right with government under God's authority to punish when necessary or to bring in justice when necessary because of our original inherent sin that we commit daily. Did that make sense?
I think so. See, there's kind of two parts. Can we enforce justice as a government, and are we still immoral on the Sabbath? Is that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've never, what I've really seen of that again about Sabbath is on the seventh day, there was no sin.
Mm-hmm.
God rested. And so we're to honor that sinless day, the original seventh day. But everyone after that, from the beginning of human, we commit sin on that day. And so part of that is God providing power to governments to correct the sins that we commit. So it's just on the part of governments to implement discipline or justice when necessary.
Okay, I see. So, in the terms of the Sabbath, I think yes, we are still immoral on the Sabbath. We can try to attain not being sinful on the Sabbath, but it is likely that we'll still be sinful. And in terms of the governments enforcing it, I think that God isn't giving governments the direct right to enforcing justice, but I think governments still need a little bit of justice, or there would be anarchy. But that is not really. I think I answered the question. Sorry, I'm confused. Is that answer?
No, you've done well. But what I really want you to take away from me is my aha moments of that the Sabbath itself was a sinless day, and that's we're to honor it, yet we're still sinful. And that Augustine affirms in his writings that we have the original sin nature of our parents, Adam and Eve.
Thank you. Ella.
Good job.
Thank
I
you.
have two questions about some of the points you made, and sort of if you could expand upon them and why you chose them. So I liked how you talked about the Odyssey. It reminded me a lot of that one GUT1 paper we wrote when we had to talk about the character of Odysseus. So that was kind of cool to see like the growth of doing that
Yeah.
and then being here now. But so I was wondering, so you, for most of your examples, you basically made a conclusion, oh, and this was just and this was unjust. But you brought up the example of when he has an affair with Circe, but then he ends up you didn't really make a conclusion there, so I was wondering what your conclusion on that would be. Just because that's interesting.
I think he kind of has a moral dilemma there where he has to decide who is more important, the marriage between his wife and his men. I think him being adulterous towards his wife with Circe is still immoral. I think if he were to have not been adulterous with Circe, even though his men would still have been left as swine, he wouldn't really be considering committing an injustice because they kind of gotten themselves into that situation. So, yeah, I think that answers.
Yeah, thanks, because that was just a really interesting developing part. So my other question would be, is you talk about a lot about how the Ten Commandments are the foundation of American justice. So my question is, so we know in the Bible, so we have the old law, but then we have our new covenant with Jesus Christ. So Paul talks about that in Romans and all of his letters. And then, in GPT, we read commentary on Galatians, and Martin Luther is absolutely against the law. And basically said it's invalid, but then we also know there is value to not murdering people. So why do you feel that the Ten Commandments are still just because I'm interested to hear your reasoning, why you feel those are still a legitimate thing to base our government on, if maybe that's not what we're going to base our faith on?
Okay, I see. So, I think if I understand your question correctly, it's can we still base our government off the Ten Commandments?
Yeah, basically because we are not necessarily held by rules through our faith anymore, and our salvation isn't dependent on it, so why is that important in justice?
Wait, so you're saying that we don't really need to consider the Ten Commandments in Christianity?
Not quite, but like, if we broke a commandment, that wouldn't mean we lost our salvation. So, so they're not like as relevant. So, why would you choose to model our government after them anyways?
Okay, I see. I think that is more humans sinning, and it's evident that all humans sin at some point in their lives. It's sometimes more common in others. So we can use the Ten Commandments as something to attain. We can't perfectly attain it, but we can use that as a goal. And in terms of basing our government off of it, I think that is also it's a good foundation for government because again, it's something we can attain. Or try to attain, I should say.
Last question.
Ollie.
Okay, I'm not sure if I completely got the right assumption, but you were talking a lot about the Ten Commandments, kind of bouncing off of Ella's question, and talking about government and justice and all that. So I was just wondering if, in your opinion, do you believe that religion and government should be intertwined?
I think that it would be wonderful if we could have a government intertwined with Christianity. I think that is what we had originally, but
Can you explain then the Establishment Clause that the Founding Fathers wrote into the First Amendment of the Constitution, which basically said that the United States federal government does not have the authority to establish or prohibit religion. But specifically that clause, do you think that they were just throwing religion away, or was that a good thing?
I think they were kind of removing Christianity from the government, but they still used it as kind of a foundation for the government. That was kind of their baseline, even if they weren't directly saying, this is the first commandment, this is the second commandment. They still had that in government. So I think it was probably needed for them to not have religion in the government, which is disappointing, but we kind of needed.
Can you explain why that's disappointing? Like why having church and state is a good thing?
Okay, I see. Okay. Well, that's a hard one to answer. Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like I'm being really pushy, but they saw through history that there was an issue having church and state together, which
Mhm.
is why they wrote the Establishment Clause. So can you
I
maybe?
think that kind of goes back to humans trying to enforce immorality on other people. It's just, we can't perfectly enforce justice on others. It's just, we can never attain that. We can possibly try to, but we can't. I think it's not the greatest idea for humans to try to enforce it.
Enforce justice?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Roper.